At this time, I'm happy to welcome to the stage our next presenter. I would like to introduce Russ White, who will be presenting Privacy for Providers. Russ is an infrastructure architect at Juniper. This is Russ' 8th time presenting at NANOG. Russ first spoke with us at NANOG 60 in 2014, where he spoke about the trade-offs in network complexity. Welcome back to NANOG, Russ. It's a pleasure to have you on stage today.
Thanks. Right here. All right. So I'm going to leave myself some notes here. Anybody who's watched me present before knows I like to walk around. So this is kind of an experimental presentation. For those of you who know me well, or don't know me that much even, I just finished a PhD in philosophy, and one of the chapters of a dissertation I worked on involved privacy. So I've been spending a lot of time thinking about and studying privacy and what it means philosophically and stuff. If you want to get more into philosophy, I'm doing a session on Friday on Safari Books Online you can come to and hear me chatter about what privacy means and stuff. But this, like I said, is kind of experimental and more of a discussion, because I'm not entirely certain that providers and vendors, particularly of network monitoring stuff, have really thought through privacy and where things come in. So this is all kind of new for me. So bear with me as I kind of figure out where I'm going. And feel free to jump in with questions and stuff or comments, because again, I think we need to have a discussion about this and figure out what we're doing. So I often hear things when I talk about privacy like, if you have done nothing wrong, you have nothing to hide. Or here is Robert Epstein in the legal regulation of genetic discrimination from the Boston University Law Review. The plea for privacy is often a plea for the right to misrepresent oneself to the rest of the world. I'll just say this is total nonsense. Privacy really, really is important to people for a lot of different reasons. First of all, it has a lot to do with identity formation and the right to be wrong and to change your mind. And if you don't have privacy to get things wrong, then you don't have privacy to grow. We live in a world now where things are recorded forever, and if you're ever wrong once, you're kind of screwed for the rest of your life because nobody ever forgets. This is a privacy issue. There's an instance in a book called, what's the name of the book? It's called The Switch, if you've ever read that, of the importance of privacy among a bunch of medical interns who were trying to change the culture in a hospital and how important it was for them to meet privately to build kind of their own culture. There's a lot of reasons that privacy is really important. So bottom line here is, providers, vendors, the networking industry needs to take privacy a little more seriously. If you know much about the IAPP or IAAP, International Association of Privacy Professionals, they do a lot of work with coders and stuff like that, but the infrastructure side of things isn't very well covered. So this is, in my opinion, these kinds of excuses are nonsense, and we need to stop making those arguments. So the first question I have to ask is you're a transit provider, does a packet that I'm forwarding through the network contain what would be considered private information? This is something, I've talked to Russ Housley about this, and Russ Housley's perspective is the answer is no. The IP address is not PII, privately identifiable information or personally identifiable information. I've spent a lot of time looking at this question. These are some definitions from the GDPR and HIPAA about what is actually personally identifiable information. And if you really look at these, any information relating to an identified or identifiable natural person, a data subject, or an identifiable natural person who is one who can be identified directly or indirectly by an identifier such as a name, IP addresses appear to fall into that, even if you run them through NATs and you do other things that are obfuscating. So I would argue from the beginning that, yes, IP addresses actually are PII, and we need to, as networking folk, deal with that reality and figure out what we do about it, rather than saying, oh, that's just not true, IP addresses are not PII. We need to back up and realize in some jurisdictions they're explicitly called out legally as PII, and we need to think through what that means for network operators and vendors and how that all is going to come out. So this presentation is, again, kind of my initial thoughts in that area. There's nothing well-defined here. I'm not going to give you solutions that are like, snap, you can go fix this. Again, this is like, okay, I've been looking at this. This concerns me. We need to think about it. All right, so let's start with when I'm forwarding a packet. Does forwarding a packet do what is called disclosure in the privacy world? Does it disclose information? And this is where a lot of people get really messed up around PII and IP addresses and deep packet inspection and what's going on inside the router. Theoretically, the router picks the packet up, stores it for some period of time, and processes it. And if the IP address and other information contained in the packet is in fact PII, then the router is handling PII. So this is something that people are very concerned about. Normally I would draw on this slide, and I didn't set my presentation up correctly for this particular thing. But now I'm going to make an argument in just a minute that it really doesn't matter that the IP address is a PII. But let's try to look at some of the dimensions of data to understand that argument before I get into it. So the dimensions of data that you get into with privacy professionals are things like identifiability. What degree can you use, to what degree can you identify a person from that piece of information? And I'll give you an example that I use all the time. Every time you call your bank, what do they say? What are the last 4 digits of your social security number? And they think they're being quite clever because it's not your entire social security number. And they're absolutely wrong. The first set of digits, the first 5 digits in your social security number are actually set by the date and time and place of your birth. So if somebody knows your date and place of birth, they know the first 5 digits of your social security number. So if your last 4 digits are leaked, which are only based on time, by the way, they now have your total social security number. So identifiability is something that's strange because it doesn't have to be just one thing that identifies you. It can be your location plus your IP address, etc. So network centrality is the next thing that we talk about in privacy, in the world of privacy. And this is the degree to which information stays local to the client. Confidentiality is the extent to which information is accessible by others. Availability, you can see these definitions for yourself. Let's think about these things in terms of forwarding an IP packet. Identifiability, I've already said I would argue that the IP address is in fact PII. That it's called out in some jurisdictions, but so we know that the information is identifiable just from the packet format or just from the packet itself. But what about network centrality? Where does the information go? It stays in the router while it's being processed and it's carried across the network, host to host. So therefore, network centricity kind of is intermediate, questionable in the network forwarding process. Confidentiality, how easy is it to access that data? If you're forwarding a packet, how hard is it to go on the console of a router? Not talking about logging at this point. Logging is a separate problem. How hard is it to see the data about what's going on in the packet? How hard is it to get to the console of the router to be able to do the debugs to see the packets that are being forwarded? So that's actually pretty difficult in a network situation, except for the people who have the right access. Availability, well, it's kind of doesn't really seem to matter. And integrity, of course, we expect the network to carry data across it with integrity. And mobility doesn't seem to apply very much to a networking situation. So I would say, from a PII perspective, when I'm forwarding packets, if I'm looking at the privacy of the information, the only thing that really hit me are the identifiability and the network centricity. I think that my confidentiality is pretty high. Now, the other aspect that privacy professionals talk about is the use of the data. Is this the primary use for the data or the secondary? And this is where we get to the nuts and bolts of dealing with an IP address as a PII or as a personally identifiable piece of information, because I am using the IP address to forward the traffic, which is what the user expects me to do. So there is an implicit draw there. You send me traffic, it has an IP address on it. That IP address can identify you, but you sent me the packet to do something with it. Therefore, from a privacy perspective, I have a defense in that from that perspective right there. So again, questionable, definition dependent, confidentiality seems to be high, availability seems to be variable, integrity seems to be high. So I am using it for the primary purpose for which the data was provided to me. So it seems to me when I look at routing traffic, looking at the way I actually process packets in a network, privacy when processing the packets is not a big deal, because the privacy value of the information being used, the IP address by itself, is pretty questionable or not complete. The second thing is it's being used for its primary purpose. And the third thing is the confidentiality of the information is actually pretty high. It takes a lot of work to get to the console and do something with it. Now, the next question that you should ask is somebody who's forwarding traffic, what about the information inside the packet? Frankly, I don't have a lot of answers here. If I'm doing deep packet inspection or anything like that, a lot of this is going to depend on encryption. So, for instance, when I worked at LinkedIn, we had a project going to encrypt all the traffic on the data center fabric, specifically for this reason, was to protect the privacy of the information in flight across the network. So the network only had access to the IP headers to do the forwarding. But this is really, really unexplored space. So this again is where a conversation could take place and we could think about it. Now, let's talk about logging, because logging is frankly what scares me when I first started looking at this. We log things like the IP address, which I've already argued is PII. We log things like the location of the user. Some logging systems say, okay, where is the user physically attached? When users are active, we know that. We don't always log it, but we know that. What users are accessing, clearly we log that information, or we know that information. DNS queries and responses. The DNS system is a huge privacy leak. There's lots of privacy leaks around DNS, and we really haven't started to address those. We think we started doing stuff there with DOH. I would argue that's not necessarily true. There have been some papers done on privacy leaks in DOH and DOT that show that it's not quite as private as we think it is. There are lots of things to think about there. And of course, we have access to the access credentials as they fly across the network. And sometimes if I'm doing packet captures, I'm actually capturing that information in my logs. And again, this is now PII. How many of y'all treat your log files in your network as private information? My guess is nobody, because we don't think about it that way. But the reality is, from a privacy professional's perspective, from a risk situation, looking at it as a risk, this is actually private information. So now let's think about what we can do about this. Let's say, okay, let's agree or not agree or whatever. Let's have the discussion. Is this private information or not? But if I give that it's private information, what do I do about this? To understand what I do about this, I have to start way back at the beginning and start talking about what is a data lifecycle from a privacy perspective. What do I do with this data? How do I handle it in a way that makes sense from a privacy perspective? So if I look at data lifecycle, I have just 3 or 4 basic things I'm doing with data. I have collection, processing, disclosure, retention, and destruction. Those are the only things that I really do with data from a privacy perspective. Most of the interesting things that happen to data happen in the processing and disclosure realm. So I have 2 types of disclosure. One is use and one is breach. So of course a breach is an unattended disclosure or a disclosure to somebody who shouldn't have the information. And a use is authorized use of the data. So I have these different steps. So now let's think about this from, let me see, do I have... Okay, so if I think about this from a logging perspective, right, my collection is logging, but do I have consent for capturing that logged information that's PII? I would almost guarantee you, you don't do that. We don't look at consent because we don't treat this as PII. On the processing side, when I look at it, am I transporting the data in a secure way across the network? Probably not, because I'm not looking at it as private information. Disclosures, do I try to maintain against breaches with my logging data? Most of the time the answer is going to be no. By the way, it's very interesting because I just had a discussion with Mira, who is the chair of the IAB, and this topic came up in the context of the IAB. And she said, well, as a university researcher, what you have to do is you have to de-identify log information I get from large providers. And I'm thinking, yeah, but we don't do that internally. We don't think about that. So retention, of course, I want to retain it. And then destruction. Do I have a clear destruction policy? So one thing is that we might want to think about, and this is a legal question. I'm not a lawyer, so don't quote me, but this is something that might be worth thinking about, is do we have consent policies around logging? We're logging people's PII. Are we doing consent? Is that built into the contracts that we offer to our customers or other things like that? Maybe it should be. Maybe we should think about that and think through the implications of that part of our problem space. Now, if I'm going to retain and use data, one thing I probably need to think about from a privacy perspective is the methods that I use to de-identify or hide information so that I don't have. So what I want to do in the world of privacy, there's a thing around privacy, is that I don't want to get to my legal responsibilities. What I want to be is I want to be risk averse. I want to reduce my risk. I don't want to try to be just legally correct. I want to be and not be legally culpable. I actually want to reduce my risk. So when I think about how to reduce my risk with data, in the privacy world, again, there are several things that you do. You do de-identification or you do hiding. Hiding is, of course, access controls, encryption, access monitoring, things like that. Is data being exfiltrated? De-identification has three basic ways that they do this: suppression, noise injection, and generalization or aggregation. Now, the nature of data that we're dealing with in the network, suppression and noise injection really aren't useful, right? I don't want to inject false sessions into my logs to de-identify things. That would be kind of silly. It messes up my network monitoring. It destroys my accuracy. Noise injection, suppression, same thing. I mean, I can't just remove things. So really what we have to get to is something like generalization or aggregation of data over time. And so I think that's really where we should focus our efforts in thinking about privacy in logging and network operations. Now, legally, most jurisdictions that write privacy laws give users special rights to data. So again, this goes back to the legal requirements given by different jurisdictions. You'll find California has this particular law. GDPR, HIPAA, all these things have their own things. But generally, you can take all of those things and put them into one of these buckets. Access. So does the user have the right to access the data that you have on them? This seems to me to be something that would be applicable to logging data and data that we're collecting as a network operator in our normal operation. Reification, the right to correct information. So I can't figure out how that one would apply to a network operator because it's either true or it's not true. Like, yes, you access this network on a certain date with a certain IP address. Like, I don't know what to be corrected about that. Deletion, maybe a user has a right to come to you and say, I really want you, I'm dropping you as my service provider. I want you to drop all of your log entries about what I've queried through DNS. I don't know. That's something that needs to be thought out legally and figure out, like, is that something we need to do? Restriction. Do users have the right to restrict who the provider shares their information with? By the way, this falls or backs into the problem of net neutrality, right? Because net neutrality is in many ways an argument over who gets the user data and who gets to share the user data and monetize it. So this is something else that we get into is probably true that a user should be able to say, no, don't sell my DNS queries to a third party for analysis, for targeted advertising. Portability doesn't seem to make a lot of difference against automated decision making. So this is interesting because here is where you're going to run into things like Cloudflare and Alchemy and dealing with third-party marketplaces for advertisements. And does the user have a right to not have their information used to do targeted information? This is written into GDPR. It's written into California's law. It's written into a lot of other laws. And again, it's something that we don't think about as providers. We think it applies to Google and Microsoft and others, but really it probably applies to CDNs as well. So it's another area that needs to be thought about. Private action, does the user have the right to take legal action against the provider? Probably doesn't make any difference. But anyway, there are lots of things here that we should think about that we probably aren't thinking about very well right now. So my bottom line is this. We need to take privacy seriously as providers, all kinds of providers. We need to start thinking about this. It's only going to take one major breach that releases a lot of DNS queries for somebody and reveals some private information, and people are suddenly going to put the spotlight on us. So the legal landscape is really changing. You probably need to consult legal folk, whatever. Again, I'm not a lawyer, so that's pretty much it for me. Unless you have questions, I'm sure there will be questions here someplace. Yes, go ahead. Whoever wants to come to the mic.
Hi, this is Barry Cook. I'm a consultant and I do work for Atherton Fiber. And my question was, what about things like descriptions on access switches and things like that?
So those would be, so privacy has two dimensions, right? One is the end user's privacy. The other is protecting proprietary information for your operations. So I would think that would fall more into proprietary information for operations. And I would still classify those as very important to protect myself.
Yeah.
So.
Yes. Thank you.
Thanks. Go ahead. Sorry, I'll
no,
move my little.
Actually, I can. We have a question from online from Adair Texton. I apologize, mispronounced the name. The question is informed consent relevant here? If data collected is spelled out in an AUP, and you know most people don't read the AUP, does that matter?
So the way most privacy regulations that I've read are written is informed consent has nothing to do with secondary uses. You have to have informed consent even for primary use cases. So if you're logging the data, even just to say, I want to check my network operations, it's kind of questionable, but it seems like that's something that would need to be looked into and say, and different jurisdictions might have different answers to that question. But I personally think that if you're running, at this point after investigating this, if you're running a transit provider, you maybe ought to think about having an informed consent thing in your contract with your customers and say, please note I am collecting information, some of which may be considered PII in certain jurisdictions. This is how I manage that data, kind of a thing.
Gotcha. I have a question. We here as network operators, it sounds like you're really, I think this is very helpful because you bring in visibility for us to be aware. And one thing for us is to think about, are we using the right protocols for logging information? And do you have any recommendations, and even do we even have the protocols we need for secure transfer? Is this something that needs to be worked at IETF, or maybe it's already being worked?
So as far as I know, there's no work going on. Well, there's SAV. There's a couple of working groups that are looking at privacy preserving transport. But as far as protocols go, no, I'm not sure that the protocols we have today, other than just end-to-end encryption, are giving us a lot of what we need to think about.
Okay. Okay. Any more questions? Anybody? Comments, observations? Okay, well, thanks, Russ. Very
Thank
much.
you.
Appreciate it. That was really good.
Thanks.
Thanks.